Hello, jazz bass lovers. My name is Hans Sturm. I'm professor of double bass and jazz studies at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and also at this moment happen to be president-elect of the great International Society of Bassists. That's right, we have an International Society of Bassists with over 4,000 members in 40 countries, and they're going to be coming to Lincoln the first full week of June in 2021. So keep an eye out for that. I'm sure it'll be very exciting. So I'm here to talk to you about the upright double acoustic bass. I'll step back a little bit so you can see a little bit more of this lovely instrument. Maybe pick it up a little bit. There you go. So bass is a member of the bowed string family. That includes the violins, violas, cellos, and so we can play it with the bow, like so. We can play it this way. Or it can be played more often in jazz, played what we call pizzicato, or with a finger. Plucking the strings. So I'd like to I'd tell you a little bit about the instrument itself. The bass as an instrument is the oldest of the bowed string instruments. It dates back to the viol family. It dates back to the early 16th and even 15th centuries, as opposed to the violin family, which came along a little bit later. But all of the bowed string instruments have several things in common. Normally, there are 4 strings. You have some 5-string basses, even uprights, but normally 4 strings. Unlike the rest of the string family that's tuned in fifths, the bass is tuned in fourths. Like the bottom 4 strings of a classical acoustic or electric guitar, E, A, D, G. E's lowest, A, D, and G. Those are the bottom 4 notes of the bass. There are 3 different kinds of wood being used to build basses, generally speaking. The top is made of spruce, which is a lighter, very reverberant wood. And then generally the sides and the back are made of maple. Sometimes you see other woods. Some makers like to use poplar, others like to use willow, some like to use black walnut. But generally you're going to have a spruce top and maple back and sides. The third wood is ebony, which is a very, very hard African wood. And it's used to make the fingerboard and also the tailpiece, which you can't see on this bass unless I hold up the bass very high. The bass has a scroll at the top. You can see this lovely scroll here at the top where the tuning mechanisms are. And then we have the nut, the fingerboard. Down below we have the bridge, and then the F-holes, and the bottom of the bass has got the tailpiece and the end pin. So that's a little bit about the bass itself. The strings on most modern instruments we play today are made out of steel, some kind of steel or alloy, like a tungsten alloy. And then they're either a straight steel wrapped wire, or sometimes there's a rope core. Occasionally we have a hybrid. Originally, of course, strings were made out of gut, out of intestines, sheep intestines, cow intestines, and they're still being made today. You have gut makers, very refined gut makers. Sometimes the gut is wrapped, sometimes it's not. Gut reacts a lot to humidity and temperature changes, so they're very flexible strings, and they can dry out and be a little bit squirrely to work with. Strings are more stable. So generally speaking, since the early 60s-ish, bass players have been gravitating generally towards steel strings, although there are plenty of bass players who like to use gut strings as well. Typically, like I said, the bass is tuned in fourths. Normally, there are some alterations to that, but it's tuned exactly like its cousin, the electric bass. There's no difference. The pitches are the same. One thing that makes the bass peculiar and a little bit interesting is that the vibrating string length, that is, the length of the string, is not standardized. So let's say you play a guitar, you're an acoustic guitar player. Generally, if you pick up this guitar or that guitar, the shape of the box may be a little bit different, but where you put the fingers are going to be more or less the same. Like if you sit at a piano or you sit at an organ. the notes, you expect them to be a certain distance apart. It may be more difficult to press down this piano than that one, the keys on the piano. But with the bass, the range of string length varies from between something like 39 inches to upwards of 43 inches. So if you think about that, the space that you're playing in, the notes are that much further apart. And of course, we don't have frets on this instrument, so it becomes very challenging to pick up a different bass than you've seen before. So we want to speak about jazz. And so I'd like to speak about, normally, when you think about the bass like this, you think about this kind of line. It's kind of a boogie-woogie line, but you're feeling those quarter notes, ding, 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 ding. When we hear a bass line like that, we call that a walking line, like our fingers are walking. That quarter note line we call a walking line. Sometimes we'll play a section of a tune where we'll play what we call a two beat. So we'll play a bounce. And sometimes it's called the businessman's bounce. We just play in two. And then we get to the bridge, or the middle section of the song, we may walk. Walking bass line is in quarters. And playing in two is just playing 2 beats per bar, playing on beat 1 and beat 3, kind of bouncing forth in a broken feel as opposed to 4. And then we see other stylistic variations. There are lots of Latin variations. So for instance, a bossa, or we see a samba. There are tons of other kinds of variations, including we see kind of funky things happen and rock kinds of things happen in jazz music as well. So the bass player needs to be able to negotiate whatever style is correct for the music that's being played by the ensemble. It's not often that we see solo bass concerts or even bass in a duo setting like Jackie and I performed for Jazz in June. But very often it's a larger ensemble, piano, bass, and drums, guitar, bass, and drums, and then maybe adding horns, saxophones, and trumpets, something like this. But when we think about that particular grouping, piano, bass, and drums, for instance, if you go to a big band concert, large jazz ensemble concert, you'll see at the back there'll be a line of trumpets, and then a line of trombones, and then a line of saxophones. So you'll have a couple alto saxophones, a couple tenor saxophones, baritones in the saxophone section. The trombones, you'll see tenor trombones and 1 bass trombone, normally. Trumpets, it'll all be B-flat trumpets in the back. And then we have what's called the rhythm section. But the rhythm section isn't comprised of like instruments. The rhythm section is the piano, the bass, and the drums. And each instrument has its own role, has its own purpose. The piano plays the chords, like the skeleton, like the ribs, if you will. The drummer has got the fire. They've got the beat, the pulse, but they're also the loudest thing on the bandstand, hitting the cymbals and so on. What the bass does is provide the heartbeat, and that's that walking line. It makes you feel like you're moving ahead, putting one foot in front of the other. We call it, that's a swing, kind of a swing time. So the other thing I wanted to do today was to share a little bit about some bass players that I consider to be heroes, historically important bass players. These are folks, bassists, ordinarily you wouldn't know the names of the bass players. You would know who the saxophone player is. You would know the name of Louis Armstrong playing trumpet, or Charlie Parker playing alto saxophone, or Lester Young or John Coltrane playing tenor saxophone. But chances are you wouldn't know who the bass players are. And some of the bass players did not live long lives. So for instance, we can say one of the most innovative early bass players, his name was Jimmy Blanton. Jimmy Blanton died when he was only 23 years old, very, very young, but played with the Duke Ellington Band and played some duets and trios with Duke, and he had a great facility. He could move around the bass more so than anybody else had done. He lowered his strings a little bit and played up into what we call the thumb position, where your hand comes into this area. So he lived, I think he was born in 1922. The next bass player I want to speak about is Oscar Pettiford. And Oscar Pettiford was what we would call the bebop bass player. The bebop style of music, the tempos came up from the big band era, small ensembles, faster tempos, more angular ensembles. And he was, I would call, say, the quintessential bebop player. He played with Charlie Parker. He had his own big band, lived in Europe for a time. And one of the tunes that he wrote is a tune called Tripitism. And it goes a little bit like this. So you get that sense, it's all eighth notes now. It's not a quarter note kind of melody. It's really moving. So that's a little taste of Tripitism by Oscar Pettiford. Coming a little bit later was Charles Mingus. Charles Mingus is a very powerful bass player, and he was well known as a band leader. He made a terrific record. He loved Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington was his hero. And he made a record with Duke Ellington and the great drummer Max Roach called Money Jungle. He was a band leader. He wrote his own tunes for his ensemble called the Jazz Workshop, the Mingus Jazz Workshop. And he taught his musicians how to play the tunes by rote. That means he would play them and have them imitate what he was playing rather than handing them music. One of his most famous tunes was a tune that he wrote for Lester Young. Lester Young was a tenor saxophone player, and Lester was a very gentle man who always wore what was called a pork pie hat. It was a wide-brimmed hat. And so he wrote this tune for him called Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, which has a lot of bluesy influences in it. Now, Mingus recorded that tune several times. It also got popularized by some of the rock musicians who like this idea of this very bluesy tune. It's got a strong melody you can put a backbeat to. One of the most famous recordings of that tune was by the great British guitar player Jeff Beck. Following Charles Mingus, one of my favorites, who I think is one of the swingingest bass players, is Ray Brown. Ray Brown was a little bit older than Mingus. A little bit younger than Mingus. He came slightly after, hit the New York scene, played with Charlie Parker, fell in love and married Ella Fitzgerald, the great singer, but again, not somebody that you would know. He, like Mingus, was also a leader, however. He died in, I think, 2003. Ray Brown did, and in that period, I think from the late 80s up until the time of his death, and maybe even earlier than that, he started to do bookings of groups, for instance, the Modern Jazz Quartet, but he led his own trios, piano, bass, and drums, led by him with his arrangements, and the tunes are fabulous, bluesy, really intricate arrangements. Coming a little bit after Ray is Ron Carter. Ron Carter is still alive. He was born in 1937, and he's most known for his work with Miles Davis, the great trumpet player. Ron is the most recorded jazz bass player. Over 2,200 records he's performed on. And one of the most iconic, important tunes that he played on was on a tune on what I think is one of the most important jazz records of all time is Miles Davis' Kind of Blue. And this is the tune called So What. Incidentally, Ron Carter, like Ray Brown, like Charles Mingus, like Oscar Pettiford, also was a band leader. So you can find records of Ron Carter playing both bass and what's called piccolo bass, which is like a slightly larger cello, but it's tuned like a bass 1 octave higher. So anyway, this is a little bit of So What, a tune, a line. I'm not sure exactly where it originated from. The introduction is all Ron with Bill Evans, but the melody, it's Miles, of course, when it was recorded, takes credit for everything. But this is one of the first early modal tunes, and it features the bass. Is it's only got 2 chords. It's D minor 7 or D Dorian, so we got a lot of the D stuff, and then when the bridge comes, it goes to E flat. So it's a fun tune to play on, but you got to keep track of where you are in the form. And then the last bass player that I'd like to speak about is a wonderful bass player from the region. He's Charlie Hayden. And he grew up in Iowa. His family had a farm and they had a little radio station. And so Charlie grew up learning how to sing in harmony and play along with different songs, different radio stations and so on. His ear became very, very adept. He's known for playing in the early group with Ornette Coleman. He founded a wonderful ensemble which kind of combined folk music and free improvisation with ballads and different grooves and rhythms called the Liberation Music Orchestra. Liberation Music Orchestra by Charlie Hayden is a wonderful group. He later founded a more mainstream group called Quartet West, which featured the marvelous piano playing of Alan Broadbent and the tenor saxophone of Ernie Watts, who has a sort of Nebraska connection, I guess you could say. He was one of the tenor players on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show for many years. And this tune I'd like to play for you is one of Charlie's tunes called Waltz for Ruth. And he recorded this with a wonderful guitar player, Pat Metheny. I should also say Charlie embraced, if you think about the bass playing and what we do, Charlie really embraced the low end of the instrument and a kind of melodic and slow way of playing, as opposed to somebody like Oscar Pettiford, who was very much interested in quicker moving eighth notes. Charlie's more interested in slow moving melodies. So here's a little bit of Waltz for Ruth. So it goes back and forth from that minor beginning, and then at the end, ends in majors. A very, very beautiful tune. So, just to recap the bass players that we spoke about, Jimmy Blanton, who died quite young and played with Duke Ellington. Look for his version of Pitter Panther Patter. Oscar Pettiford, sort of the king of bebop as far as the bass goes, and his tune was called Tripitism. Charles Mingus, who is a wonderful composer and arranger, and his tune was Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. Ray Brown, very wonderful swinging bass player who also played with Charlie Parker and the bebop players, but then led his own piano trios a little bit later. Ron Carter, who played bass with Miles Davis and is the most recorded jazz bass player in history, and you can look for his solo releases both on the upright bass with his ensemble and also with the piccolo bass. And then lastly, we listened to a little bit of Charlie Hayden, who was born in 1946 and died just a few years ago. He's a very melodic, thoughtful, and deep player. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a little chat about the bass and the bass in jazz. And please be sure to support live music and Jazz in June. Thank you very much for watching.